Hello, everybody. Thanks for being so patient with me as I have been absent today. We are continuing our reading of Through My Eyes by Ruby Bridges. This is an autobiography. It's written by the little girl, the woman who was once the little girl and who endured all these things when she was just a child. We're starting on page 28. Let me get to page 28. Here we go, page 28. Another first grader. So all along, Ruby had been by herself. But here is an opportunity for possibly another first grader to come. The Gabrielles were another brave family. Daisy and her husband, Jim, had several children, including a 6-year-old named Yolanda. Mrs. Gabriel had been in the army during World War II, and she refused to be bullied by protesters. When I entered William France, Daisy Gabriel did not take Yolanda out of school. I don't remember ever seeing Yolanda, even though she was a first grader. The school building was large, and any white children who attended were kept far from my classroom. They were assigned separate teachers and were hurried in and out of school through a back entrance. Yolanda Gabrielle, came to school every day for 3 weeks. During that time, her family's home was attacked. Stones and rotten eggs were thrown. Windows were broken. Hecklers gathered in front of the house and threatened to hurt the Gabrielle children. Daisy's husband was about to lose his job. Though the police set up protection for the family, and a wonderful New Orleans woman named Betty Wisdom offered to drive Yolanda to school each day, Daisy Gabrielle knew her daughter was still at risk. In the end, the Gabrielles gave up. They not only took Yolanda out of school, but also moved the family to another state, a northern state where Daisy's husband had grown up. It was time to get away from Louisiana. So this family here, this is a picture of the family. That little girl is Yolanda. That is her mother, Daisy, and her husband. This is a detective. They're walking past this crowd here. Shortly before this picture was taken, a rock had shattered the window of the car they were in. So just because this family attended the school, where it wasn't even in the same class, but just because they attended the school, they were threatened. Their lives were threatened, and their jobs were threatened. So here's a quote from Good Housekeeping magazine from April 1962. It says, Then one afternoon after the police had taken them through the mob, the children had looked behind her and suddenly became aware of the danger. That night she woke up screaming. When Daisy went to her, she was babbling about those ladies who yelled so ugly. Then Yolanda said her stomach hurt and that she didn't want to go to school the next day. Daisy held her in her arms, promising she could stay home, her heart heavy with the burden she had put on her family. So her daughter's having nightmares because of this school situation. 3 little girls at McDonough. While I was tending William France, a couple of miles away, 3 black girls were integrating McDonough number 19. Their names were Leona, Tessie, and Gail. And this is those girls, 3 girls. One hidden was behind a marshal, probably right behind this guy right here, was leaving McDonough High School. So they had the same situation here. There were crowds, and they needed marshals to protect these little girls as well. Some 30 minutes after the scheduled start of classes, the marshals pulled up at McDonough, number 19, with 3 pupils accompanied by parents, a man, and 2 women. An angry roar went up from the whites among the mixed crowd of spectators. "Kill them!" shouted one man. The police rapidly moved the crowd off the sidewalk to a parkway in the middle of the street. The parents and pupils, who were in pigtails and freshly laundered dresses, were rushed into the stucco building by deputy marshals. So once again, just because they attended school, people were shouting to kill them. This is another article from U.S. News World Report in November 18, 1960. And it says, attendance dwindled until November 17th. 3 Negro girls and 1 white child were the only pupils present at McDonough School number 19, which normally has 467 pupils. The other integrated Negro had the company of only three white children in William T. France School, which normally has 576 people. So these are not small schools. These are rather big schools. Our school doesn't even have 467 kids. So if you think about our entire school, every single kid in this school leaving just because of a black person coming to our school. And right now it seems crazy to us, but this was normal back then. It's insane. Riots in New Orleans. In those first tense days of integration, people didn't protest just in front of the schools. Trouble broke out across the city. As I sat quietly huddled with Mrs. Henry, mobs of protesters roamed the streets. People threw rocks and bricks at passing cars. Some even tossed flaming bottles of gasoline. Hospital emergency rooms began to fill up. White people drove through the city at night, leaving burning crosses as warnings in black neighborhoods. African Americans knew this was meant to frighten them into giving up integration. The segregationist organization, that's a mild way of putting it. I think they're more of a racist organization, but the segregationist organization, or racists, known as the Ku Klux Klan, have been burning crosses in front of black homes for many years all over the South. White parents from New Orleans even traveled to Baton Rouge to protest school integration in front of the state legislature. They wanted J. Skelly Wright, the federal judge who ordered integration, to be removed from office. So in this photograph here, we have 3 hooded members of the Ku Klux Klan standing next to a burning cross at a rally that they held on a Saturday night. So this is something that they did normally. They would just, that was a warning, and they would often either harm black people or threaten to kill them or anything like that. And this organization, the Ku Klux Klan, still exists today. Now, they're not nearly as powerful because racism is going down, but racism still exists. So that's why we have to fight against it. We have to be anti-racists. And we have a quote on this page from the New Orleans Times, and it's from November 24th, 1960, and it says, "Parents and children from integrated New Orleans schools bore a miniature black coffin containing a blackened effigy of U.S. Judge J. Skelly Wright into the Louisiana Capitol. The House stood up and, with a long roll of applause, saluted the parents, and the demonstrators moved into legislative chambers. One woman in the group shouted, 'The judge is dead. We have slaughtered him.' Some of the group feigned weeping and mourning. Others laughed. The blackened doll inside the yard-long coffin wore a black suit. In his pocket was a small gavel." So people were still even threatening to kill the judge. I just don't understand how people can threaten to kill people. Okay, here we have a week of trouble. In the first week of school integration, the tension in New Orleans seemed to build each day. Rioters on the streets were looking for trouble. Whites assaulted blacks in broad daylight, and the blacks fought back, even though the NAACP urged them not to. Vandals broke store windows and took what they could. To curb the crowds that gathered, extra police on horseback and motorcycles were brought in. When Mayor S. Morrison appeared on television and called for militant segregationists were enraged. They felt the mayor had betrayed him. Finally, the protests began to die down. By the end of the week, the worst of the street riots were over. Thanksgiving was coming, and the public schools were closing for a week-long holiday. City School Superintendent James F. Redmond made it clear that school integration would continue after Thanksgiving. However, resentful white parents promised not to give up. They would protest as soon as the schools reopened. The New Orleans School Board appealed to the federal court for a temporary halt to integration. The board said it needed time to settle certain legal questions. Thurgood Marshall, an NAACP lawyer who commented on the appeal, would eventually become Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is Thurgood Marshall. He's the lawyer for the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Here in New York Times from 1960 says, "Thurgood Marshall's counsel for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People opposed any suspension of desegregation. I don't think there's any amount of time that's going to bring cooperation from the legislature or the officials of Louisiana," he said. So these people they can't put them in jail for just protesting, okay? They have a right to protest. Whether we agree with their protests or not, that's their constitutional right, just like we have a constitutional right to protest. Here's another photograph. On November 16th, teenagers gathered outside of City Hall to protest the integration of New Orleans schools. Get it. Okay. And page 36. Everybody was glad for the time out for Thanksgiving, including me. Even so, the stress didn't completely go away. The owners of the small grocery store at the end of the block suddenly told my family to stay away because we were part of school integration. The white owners no longer wanted our business. My grandparents telephoned us from Mississippi to say they were afraid for us. They thought my father would be lynched, murdered by a lawless mom. My parents didn't tell us that they were afraid for their lives, but I knew my father was worried about how to make a living. The garage where he worked had fired him because I was going to a white school. Financial help was on its way, fortunately. It came through the U.S. mail. People from around the country sent gifts and money. They knew what was happening in New Orleans because of the television news programs, as well as magazine and newspaper articles. Many Americans wanted to encourage us. The money made a big difference to my family, and it kept coming for months. Along with the money came presents for me. There were toys, books, and clothes for school. The packages were addressed to me, so I thought they should be mine. My mother didn't agree. She would say, "Ruby, you have to share these things with your brothers and sister. They can't all be for you." When one child in the family is receiving a lot of attention, it can cause problems. These gifts were wonderful, but that sometimes meant a tug of war. I thought my mother was being mean when she told me that I had to give some of my presents away. We received stacks of encouraging cards and letters. Even Eleanor Roosevelt wrote me a note. So this is one of the first ladies, one of the president's wives. She was the widow of Franklin Roosevelt, the former president of the United States. Mrs. Roosevelt's note was my mother's favorite, and she looked at it again and again. Eventually, letters came from around the world. We kept a lot of them, but they didn't survive. In 1965, a huge hurricane named Betsy flooded parts of New Orleans. Mrs. Roosevelt's letter was lost in the flood, along with the Purple Heart my father received for bravery in the Korean War. Those were sad losses. And here's a quote from the New York Times in November 1960. The father of the 6-year-old girl who was transferred from a Negro school to William Frantz has been discharged from his job. The man's employer, W.E. Smith, said, "I wouldn't have an working for me with a child in a white school, would you?" He conceded that the Negro had been employed for him by him for 4 years and that he was a good worker. He said whites in the area had telephoned him, warning that they would boycott the station if they continued to employ the man. I will always remember how our neighbors on French Street helped us through the winter. They came by all the time to see how we were doing. They were nervous about the racial tension in the city. They also wanted to support us. At night, they watched the house to make sure no one was prowling around. After the Thanksgiving break, neighbors would babysit and help me get dressed for school in the morning. They would also watch for the marshal's car to arrive. Once I was in it, men from the neighborhood would walk behind the car looking for signs of trouble as the car slowly left the safety of the block. One of our neighbors, who ran his own house painting business, offered my father a job. My father didn't hesitate. He was grateful. On the spot, he began a new line of work. In December, the crowd that gathered in front of the school was smaller than before. The people who came were angry, loud militants, but the numbers were down. On December 5th, attendance at William Frantz was 18, though at the time I did not know that other children were even in the school. So here's 4 of the 17 children who attended school on December 5th. White segregationists threw eggs and rocks at the kids as they left school. So just for attending the school, they had stuff thrown at them. The legislatures in Baton Rouge were still fighting school integration in the federal courts. There was a rumor they wanted to take the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it never happened. John F. Kennedy, a liberal Democrat, had just been elected president, and segregationists in Baton Rouge knew that Washington would be less sympathetic for their cause than before. So here's a picture of a segregationist throwing an egg at a car carrying some white children who attended William Frantz in December. So this woman, she's dressed in a nice dress. So we picture racists always being like dressed in white for Ku Klux Klan or being really dirty and ugly, but racists can look like anybody, so it's hard to say. And here's a quote from John F. Kennedy. Can we honestly say that it doesn't affect our security in the fight for peace when Negroes and others are denied their full constitutional rights? Page 40. Through the winter with Mrs. Henry. After Christmas, my teacher and I settled into a routine. It was a bit odd to be the only child in class, but I finally decided that this was the way it was going to be here at France School. Being Mrs. Henry's only student wasn't a chore. It was fun and felt sort of special. She was more like my best friend than just an ordinary teacher. She was a loving person, and I knew she cared about me. Mrs. Henry and I always had fun. We did everything together, reading and word puzzles, spelling and math. We sang songs and played games. Since I couldn't go outside, we pushed desks out of the way and did jumping jack exercises. Once or twice, Mrs. Henry got permission for us to walk in the schoolyard, but it was strange to be out there with no other kids around. I remember seeing men standing off in the corners of the yard. I thought they were hiding from somebody. Later, I learned that they were plainclothes detectives. I spent so much time with Mrs. Henry, and I liked her so much that I began to speak the way she spoke. I learned later that Mrs. Henry was a northerner from Boston, Massachusetts, and she did not have a southern drawl. I didn't sound like my brothers and sister, but I didn't know why. I now know that Mrs. Henry influenced me a great deal that year. She had a polite, kind manner that I admired. In fact, I began to imitate her. Little by little, I grew to love Mrs. Henry. We became very attached to each other. So this is a picture of Ruby in the first grade, and this is a picture of Mrs. Henry. And so we are finished for today. Tomorrow Monday, we'll pick back up. Thank you.